stand tall. Alrighty, let's take a second and just pray. I know we've had beautiful worship and praise music, but let's just take a second. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord Jesus, you have been so present today. And I thank you for all the good work you've done in the hearts of every woman who's here. We ask you to send your Spirit and just to stir our hearts with love and a sense of what it is that you want us to carry from here and what it is that you would have us do back with our families or back at our work or wherever you've placed us. So Lord, I thank you for this chance to be here. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mother. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty. There we go. All right, we can go to the next. So, I want to thank you for being here, still here in the afternoon. But I want to thank you for being Catholic women. You know, in today's world, it's not easy to be a woman, and it's even tougher to be a fully Catholic woman. And so we'll talk about that in the next few minutes, but I was out at Notre Dame recently and giving a talk out there, and I was speaking on gender ideology, which, as I said, is something the church is very concerned about, but it's something that affects women too. Women-only spaces are being lost. Women are being erased in this idea that there's no difference between men and women. But at the end of the talk, I had an opportunity to speak with a young student, a very well-formed young woman whose heart was really in the right place. But as we talked, she said to me, but what does it really mean to be a woman? She said, I don't really know. And so here was someone who was searching, was looking, had good friends where she was. She was trying to live a Catholic life, but she did not have a clear sense of what does it mean to be a woman? How is it different from being a man? And what difference does it make that I'm a Catholic woman? So I think these are questions that, whether we realize it or not, the world has had an impact on us in terms of shaping our understanding of what it means to be a woman. And so you can see from the slide up there, there's been a big lie foisted on women, telling us that to be equal really means to be a man. It's as if the default paradigm is how men did it. And that's something feminism got wrong from the beginning. And there were a lot of things that feminism pointed out that were real injustices that needed to be corrected. And I often think of my mom, who went to business school. And when she was graduating from business school, she was a really good student. She couldn't get a job except as a secretary to fellow male students whom she had outperformed. But it was because at that time, in the 50s, at least where she was, people said, you're gonna get married, you're gonna have children, what difference does it make? And so there was a real undervaluing of what women brought to any situation. And there was an unwillingness, perhaps, to bring women's gifts, to open up opportunities for women. So those things were real. But what did feminism get wrong? It got wrong some very basic things. That the way to be fully free, the way to be women, is not to look at men and say, I want that. I want to be that. But unfortunately, as our laws have developed over the past 30, 40, 50 years, the premise in our law is that equality under the law means we can do anything men can do. And that's sort of the cultural thing too, and we've seen that with the sexual revolution, where women, instead of calling men to let go of that double standard, to stop shaming women, instead of calling men to live virtuously, and to extend forgiveness and mercy to those who fall. Instead, women said, hey, great, we get to do that too. And so there's been a lot of distorted thinking that, again, we sort of, I think, absorb, whether we like it or not. And part of it is in terms of measuring our value. I read studies all the time, just as part of my work, on sort of women's place in the culture. And there are always, it's almost an annual thing, there are new studies coming out about, first it was the marriage penalty, that women, when they get married, they don't earn as much as men. And then now they've refined the data and probed a little deeper, and now it's the motherhood penalty. That because women have children, we're being discriminated against because we don't end up earning the same and having the same opportunities. And the problem is, it devalues what women value. Women, when you talk to women consistently, and there's survey data on this, women value the opportunity to be there for their families. And so, how do you equate earning an extra $200,000 with having a child? One of the things that we got wrong was that we didn't ask society to make room for us as women. Instead, we said, we'll play the game the way men have always played it. Well, men and women are different. Our bodies are different. Our interests are different. The fact that we bear children is a huge gift. And yet, as the church has taught, we need to bring our talents into society, but we need to do it in a way that allows us to live our vocation. So, keep it on that side for a minute. One of the other problems with what the culture has told women is that we're valued as sexual objects. And we've seen that particularly in terms of pornography. And it's valued as sort of the wrong word, but we've made it okay for women to be objectified. And women have made it okay for women to be objectified. And so there are young women that I speak to who are growing up and they look at this and they look at the sexualized culture and they say, they're repulsed by that. And many of them begin to be repulsed by men because they see this and they don't want to be treated as an object. And yet, what does the culture then tell them? Well, maybe you're a lesbian and maybe that's the route for you. And, so the lie continues. But what's at fault here is a misunderstanding of who we are as women, where our dignity comes from, the value that we have just simply for being women. Another thing that is part of this is this flattening that there's no difference between men and women. And we see this with the whole emphasis on the transgender thing, which is, you can keep it right there, but let me just say a word about the transgender issue, because it's something that everyone's going to encounter in some way or another because the laws are changing. It is driving changes in the law in a way that is not going to be helpful to women. But one of the things you ought to think about, just in terms of common sense, is when someone says, okay, I'm a boy, but I was born in the wrong body, I really should be a girl. You have a man who says, I know I'm a woman because I have this internal sense of being a woman, which is the transgender claim. Think about that. What makes them think they know what it feels like to be a woman? They've never been women. They don't have women's bodies. They haven't gone through the experiences that women have gone through. All they have is an idea of what it must be like to be women. And I was speaking to a young woman who went to one of the military academies where there was a young man who decided that he was a transgender woman. And so when he was off duty, he would go out with them and he would dress as a woman. And she said her friends were trying to be accepting, right? They're trying to be kind and, okay, sure, you can come if you're willing to take the risk, because he wasn't allowed to do that under the military rules. But he would go out when he decided to be a woman. He would be the most stereotypical, kind of almost repulsively caricaturing what it meant to be a woman. And what this young woman said to me was, after a few times, she and her friends just looked at each other and they thought, is that what he thinks we're like? Because he would adopt mannerisms. It was just like every stereotype is what he was putting on. Now the poor boy, poor guy, obviously had issues. So I don't mean to make light of his problems. But I do want to point out just that fundamental common sense thing that we should be holding on to is, if you're a man, if you are born with a male body, these differences go through every cell of our body. You can't possibly know what it feels like to be a woman. So that claim is false, just in and of itself. So how did we get off? How did things get so far wrong? Well, if you go back to the early radical feminists, and I want to be clear here, when I say feminists, I'm really talking about radical feminists, because there are many good women who saw the problems and injustice of women not having opportunity. And so there were many needed changes in the law. But the radical feminists, the ones who were doing theorizing back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whose theories now are carried out in law, these women, for the most part, were women who had rejected God. They were women, many of whom were Marxists. And so they viewed not just capitalism, which we're familiar with Marxism being critical of capitalism, but they viewed the family as oppressive. And they viewed, because they viewed the family as oppressive, they viewed men as oppressive. And so children were a burden. And there was this whole sense that women could only be free if they rejected men, children, and religion. And so the top woman up there is a woman named Shulamith Firestone. Very, very sad life, really, but she wrote a book in 1970 called The Dialectic of Sex, in which she imagined what it should be like for women if we were really to be equal. And she said, we have to abolish sex difference. There is no meaningful sex difference. So that women should never be forced to carry children. And so she imagined, even though the technology wasn't there, she imagined all the artificial reproductive technologies that we have today. She didn't imagine them literally, but she imagined that that's where society would move to. Because for women to be free, for women to be the same as men, women had to be freed from childbearing. So really what happened was this alienation from our bodies, which I think is why it's so significant that John Paul II and the theology of the body sort of brought us back into focusing on the reality that the church has always taught, that we're a unity of body and soul. But so these early feminists, Shulamith Firestone, got it wrong about our bodies and sexual difference and men, and saw it all as oppressive. Fast forward, that is one of the roots of the transgender movement, because now you have people who are called queer theorists or gender theorists who say, they build on that earlier work, and they say there is no difference. They deny bodily sex. So when I look at materials that are being promoted to schools, in many places they don't even talk about biological sex anymore. They talk about sex assigned at birth. Or the worst was one in a Maryland school district that didn't even teach the kids now about sex, at least when they're talking about gender and all the LGBT stuff. They didn't even talk about biological sex. They referred to a person's designation as their legal gender marker. In other words, you're not a woman. You're not a female. All you have is a legal gender marker, which is something that can be changed. So it's denying that there's something different about male and female, which makes sense if you go back to the idea that they're denying God. They don't believe that God created us male and female. So what should we know? What should we know about men and women and what it means to be a woman? You can go ahead and shift. So this is just a joke here. The internet is full of memes. I pulled this one off actually a number of months ago when I was giving a talk to seminarians, and they howled. They thought it was hilarious. Partly because one of the seminarians told me that, when you're in the seminary and you're preparing to forego family life, forego expressing your sexuality and marriage and all that stuff, he said all you can think of is sex. It just becomes, so they laughed at that. What else? We can turn this. There are some things intuitively you know, within pop culture, we can see there are differences between men and women. You tell your husband to go get a blue set of sheets. Well, unless you specify, he's just going to look, and blue is blue, right? It could be navy, it could be aqua, it could be whatever. To you, that's going to make a huge bit of difference, right? But to him, it's blue. So these are things that we notice. But let's talk about some real differences between men and women. There is now something called gender medicine, which really should be sexual difference medicine or something. Gender is sort of it's a word I have a problem with because now it's taken on a meaning totally disconnected with the body. But anyway, it's called gender medicine. And what it is over the past 30 years, they've discovered, guess what? That men's and women's bodies are different. So, yeah, I know. we needed studies and millions of dollars to tell us that, but here's why it matters. Because I remember being a child, and someone in my family was going through something. All the clinical trials used men as subjects. So when you were trying to learn about heart disease, and when you were trying to figure out what medicine would work, and you were trying to figure out a protocol for treating someone with heart disease, it was all done with male clinical subjects. So guess what? It didn't work exactly right when it came to women, because our bodies are different. And so doctors discovered they were missing the signs of women's heart attacks. They were missing the proper way to treat them, because the medicines and the dosing and things that were designed for male bodies did not work the same way in women's bodies. So now there's this whole branch of medicine that is aimed at discovering what does medicine need to know by taking into account the physical differences between men and women. So NIH recently put out, I think it was in 2016, put out an order, so to speak, that for all clinical studies, you have to specify the sex of every person in the clinical trial, because otherwise they can't interpret how to apply it. That's how important it is, because every sex in our bodies, every cell in our bodies has a sex. We are different, down to every cell in our body. How else are we different? If you look to business, there have been many studies in the business world now about the difference it makes to have women involved. That when you have women in the business world, we do things differently. So corporate boards function a little bit differently when they have women on them. Women tend to be more collaborative, team-oriented, less competitive. Doesn't mean they don't want to do well. It just means that's not their relational style in a general sense. So there are things that business has learned that point to differences between men and women. The bottom line is, science backs up what the church has long taught. Male-female difference is real. We are different. It's time we're valued for being women, not because we're trying to fit on a male trajectory. Okay, can turn. One of the greatest champions of women in the church was John Paul II. And he had a dear love for Mary, his sister spoke about. But he also wrote extensively about women. You can change it. History, oh no, that you were right, yeah. Looks different from the back here. But the church, since Vatican II, the church has actually written a lot about women. The church, in history even before then, was a champion of women. So that women were educated by the church long before society educated women. Women were given leadership opportunities, particularly in religious orders, long before women were given leadership opportunities in the wide world. It was the church that tried to change different societal customs. It said there had to be consent in marriage, that you couldn't just marry off people when they're 12 and 13. And some of these changes took a while to happen because the church operates through human beings. But by and large, the church has been the champion of women. So what do we need to know? What are some points that would be helpful to understand? Some of them you've heard perhaps in other talks, but I think one of the things I want to emphasize here is just this notion of dignity. In John Paul II's writing, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity and vocation of women. He talked about women's dignity. And the key point is that we have an equal dignity. Why? Because we're made in the image and likeness of God. Because God loved us. Our dignity doesn't depend on the law treating us equally. It doesn't depend on someone affirming us as equal in dignity. We have an inalienable dignity. Nobody can take that away from you or from me, because that comes from God. But at the same time, the church has pointed out, John Paul II in particular pointed out, men and women are different. We're different, but we are complementary. We go together. We're meant to collaborate. Our vocation is to love. And that women have something special to give there. And the way I like to think about it is this. We're familiar with the language of self-gift, that we don't find fulfillment except in giving of ourselves. Well, women's bodies tell us something. We are created with room for another. Our bodies are made with room for another person. That's an amazing thing. But that's a sign not just for us. That's a sign, there's something profound there, that God in his wisdom, not just creating a mechanism for the human race, but he gave us a sign that says, you, human beings, to love, you must be for others. You must give of yourself for others. Make room in your lives for others. That's the essence of love. And that's a message that when women alienate themselves from their motherhood, we lose the opportunity to reflect and to deepen that understanding and to be that sign for the world that we are all made for others. We're all called to love by giving ourselves to others. So there were several other documents. I'm not going to have time to go through them, but the letter to women, if you have not read that, I think especially for American women, it is a beautiful, very particular document talking about the complementarity of men and women. But I like the fact that the Pope opened up by just saying thank you. Thank you to women who are mothers. Thank you to women who are consecrated. Thank you, women who work. And he goes on and on. It's a beautiful, beautiful document. But again, he stresses the complementarity of women. So who are we? We're created equal in dignity. We are women. We are not men. We're not generic human beings. It means something to be women. We're created with room for another, that capacity for self-gift. We're made. One of the geniuses of women that Pope John Paul II talked about was our sensitivity to others. That women tend to notice the person. And guess what? In our age right now, it's a technocratic age. It's an age where the person is being valued less and less, where the person sort of disappears in the face of technology. It's up to women to humanize the culture, to keep the person at the center of things. That's what we're called to do in business. That's what we're called to do in government and public policy, is to bring back that attention to the person. That's our mission. It's not a power and ambition thing. So what is it not empowering to be? It's not empowering to be told that the only way you can be equal is if you treat your fertility like a design defect and you contracept, and then you have to have abortion or you're not equal. And that's something the Supreme Court now has taken note of in the law, in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. It speaks about how people organizing their personal relationships on the assumption that for women to have equal participation in society, they need contraception and abortion. So our equality under the law is being tied to the ability to kill our children, to be alienated from our motherhood. And that's a lie. We need to call that for what it is. All right, I want to bring you to, you can skip ahead on the next. Okay, so John Paul II in his, in Christe Fidelis Laice, his writings on the role of the laity in the modern world, talked about women having two tasks in particular. That we, by our lives, by what we say, what we do. We must testify to the dignity of conjugal life, the dignity of marriage, of family. So that's one of our missions in the world. Another is to shape the culture. That women have to shape the moral dimension of culture. And I look at the culture, from the slides that I showed you in my first talk. The wrong women have been shaping the culture. And this is why Catholic women need to know who we are and to be out there shaping the culture in a large sense. But when I say the culture starts with who's around you. It starts with every person you're in contact with. And so that is up to us. The Pope said that is one of the tasks that women have in the church. That's a huge, amazing task. But it's one that we're equipped for. So I want to give you 3 examples of three women who I think exemplify this. And first, just part of the work that I do in the Washington, D.C. area is I have a network of Catholic women called the Catholic Women's Forum. And it's women who are out there working public policy or different professions and who are trying to bring the church's teaching to bear on public policy or education or whatever they're doing. That's one way of shaping the culture, right? Writing, speaking, doing all those things. But I think closer to home, it's important that we realize every one of us can do this. And so the first person I want to tell you about is a woman, I'll call her Laura. I got to know her through parish life. She's one of the most active, cheerful, vibrant people, the person that everyone turns to when you want something done. And as I got to know her, I wondered, gosh, I sort of assumed, maybe she's had a great life and, she's just got this effervescent cheerfulness. Well, I learned her story as I got to know her. And she was married to a man who left her with 5 children. And she raised the kids and was in touch with them. He was sort of there, sort of not. She raised the kids did well. She sort of came to peace with, okay, that's her life. That wasn't how she chose it. And she got a call one day. It was from her husband. He had taken off with a lover many years ago. Well, the lover had left, and he had gotten a debilitating disease. And he'd been struggling. And he'd had a change of heart. And he said to her these words. He said, I want to come home. What would you do in that situation? Now, I'm not sure that every woman should say, come home. Depends on the circumstance. But for her, because she had worked through and was at peace with her life, and she had already forgiven him in her heart, she could say, come home. And she extended forgiveness to him in a way that was powerful. She took care of him through those remaining years of his life. She remodeled her house in order to do that, and spoke only well of him to her children, to the people around her. She was a model of forgiveness. And I can tell you that from knowing her and now knowing her story and seeing how that has affected so many people, she is a woman who is changing the world because of her love for God and her ability to forgive, and how powerful that is. The second, let's go back to Melanie, the second woman. I had the privilege of speaking at the UN for the past couple of years during for the Holy See's mission during the Commission on the Status of Women. And this year, one of the women who spoke at an event before mine for the Vatican was this woman, Melly, who was from the Philippines. And she was a survivor of sexual trafficking. And she told the story of how she was lured from her home and how she ended up in a brothel, having no idea that that wasn't what she was promised. She was promised an education, a place to stay, a place to work. And she ended up in this brothel where they gave her drugs, and as she said, she didn't have any customers for the first week because she cried anytime someone wanted to touch her. And then they withdrew her food, and it was just a horrible circumstance. So she was trafficked. She was in the red light district for almost a decade. During that time, she said her heart grew hard. She didn't trust anyone because she'd been so poorly treated and abused. And what broke through that was a human touch. There was a brother and a priest who came to that area specifically to work with the women who found themselves in that situation. And they treated her kindly, they helped her find medical care when she needed it. But what they said to her, the thing that made the difference in her life was this. They kept telling her, things can be different. Have hope. If you want to leave, if you're ready to leave, we will help you. She said it took many, many months before she believed them and was willing to act on that. But she said one day in the depths of just an awful circumstance, she remembered those words and she said, and she believed it. She had hope because somebody had reached out and treated her with kindness consistently. They overlooked, all the evil surrounding her. They didn't blame her for where she was, but they gave her hope and said, we will help. And she went through recovery for 5 years. They literally spirited her to a different city. And she was in recovery for 5 years. But she has not only recovered, she's gotten an education and she goes back to that same district. She goes back to deliver that message of hope to women who are just like her. And so I think each of us knows women, whether it's women who've suffered through abortions, women who've found themselves abandoned by a spouse, women who are alone because their children have, whatever the suffering is that you have, whatever that is, it's a burden. But you can take that, you can transform that with love, and you can bring hope, as Melly does, to others who share that burden. And that is how we can change the world. I'm going to skip the next person just real briefly, because I'm past my time here. There's a woman named Dolly Donahue who lived right near Notre Dame and spent 40 years just taking people in. It started accidentally. A neighbor kid always showed up asking for food, and one day his parents just left, and no one was there to care for him, and she took him in. And she took in homeless people for 40 years, and just had this beautiful ministry of taking care of people who just simply needed something. But what's striking is when people say, so how did you do this amazing, spectacular thing of taking care of all these people? And she said, you do what's in front of you. And that, I think, is the note to end on here. That for each of us, God has placed you in the relationships you're in the home you're in, the town you're in, the place you're in, for a purpose. Do what's in front of you. Bring that love of Christ and change the world. Thank you very much.